This is going to be great. Those of you, and welcome to another edition of Conversations. I'm Jeff De Forrest. Those of you familiar with me know of my almost obsessive fascination with track announcers, ring announcers, stadium announcers, and that brings us to today's guest, who I had the pleasure of meeting a long time ago, courtesy of one of my favorite gentlemen I've ever run across in my 43 or 4 years here in South Florida. And at the time, he was the marketing director at Hialeah Park. That is the great Frank Fiori. Been battling a few things, Pete Frank Fiori, but you know how he is. He comes out firing jabs like he was Arislan de Lara at one of those Hialeah boxing matches. And so I'm putting together a television show I would not necessarily say the most reputable of connections, but Hialeah Park was good enough to sponsor it. And I say, Frank says to me, "You ought to use this kid that is announcing the races here." I'm saying, "Races? What races? Yeah, you aren't racing. I mean, you're trying to get a casino license." But because of the fakakta state of Florida and the vile legislation that they've had regarding casinos and the parimutuel industry, unless you happen to be part of the Seminole tribe, the conditions for compliance were that Hialeah Park, to have casinos and slot machines and various casino games, they had to run some kind of horse racing. And I believe, and this is where we bring in Pete Aiello, who we should bring in with the proper greeting, which would be, can you do one with me, Pete?
Yeah. Racing at Gulfstream.
So you didn't hold it long enough, man. I mean, we used to introduce all of
Well,
our.
we can get into that though. There is a methodology behind how long I hold that.
Yeah,
If I know the horses that are in the race, it's a
yeah.
shorter racing. If I'm completely lost as to the horses that are in the race, or I have a bet on another race that's running at the same time and I need to do both, then I hold the racing as long as possible.
So, as a formal matter of introduction, let me introduce this week's guest to you. And he is the voice of Gulfstream Park and has had a very interesting odyssey, as a lot of these guys have had that have gotten into the business. There aren't that many jobs. It's kind of like coaching in the NFL, where there's like 32 jobs. So, if you have one of them, you're pretty lucky. I don't know how many racetracks are in existence here. I've probably been to them all at one point in time, but not that many jobs as a track announcer or the voice of a particular track. And if you can get to the point where you're calling the championship meet and the year-round racing that now takes place at Gulfstream Park, you have made it, my friend. And we welcome to the show Pete Aiello. Pete, how are you, first of all? Good to have you on the program. Thanks so much for doing this.
Um, I'm really looking forward to this. The amount of tributaries and little back roads that we can traverse with this conversation is going to be something. I'm sure there'll be something that you have never said on your show before, and I know there'll be something you've never heard on your show before from me. So.
Oh, no doubt about it. And we've had a wild assortment of guests, many very dignified people. And you qualify now. So you do the shortened version. See, I love it. We used to start our radio shows when we were out there doing the shows at Gulfstream Park. Our buddy Jersey Kyle and I would begin with a. So we turned blue. Right? And now, how did you develop that? And how did that come about? That you're racing at Gulfstream when you introduce the first race on the card, or start to call the first race.
Okay, so there is actually a backstory to that. So when I first got my first real job where they paid me to come in and call races every day, it was in Cincinnati, Ohio, at River Downs,
Okay.
and I was in my mid 20s, so I was trying to be as clever and little did I realize clever and cliche as possible. So I had it in my head that I wanted to say something different for the first race and something different for the last race. And I pretty much realized I was going to borrow something from another guy for the last race, but I was looking for something alliterative. So I said, you know what? I could say racing at River. That's double R. That rolls right off the tongue.
I like
So
it.
when I got hired at Gulfstream, a friend of mine said, well, you have to say racing at Gulfstream. I said, well, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't have any of that same, rhythmicness to it. I said, I'm not saying that. No, you have to do it. You have to do it. So I did it. I didn't get any feedback one way or the other. Next day, I said, well, I might as well keep doing it. I did it again. And I think it was day 4. I went into the jockey's room to get the changes in my program, as I usually do. And Eduardo Nunez, South Florida jockey legend, walked by. I'd never met him in my life, but apparently he knew who I was, because as he walked by me, he said, racing at Gulfstream, and smiled and said, I like that. I like that. And then there were a couple valets in the jocks room, too, and they said, yeah, I like that, too. So Default. It's like anything in broadcasting. If you're relying on fan feedback and it's positive fan feedback, you got something.
I still have little kids run up to me in the street because I used to throw to every break with a clip that we cut from Genial Johnny Addy announcing a Joe Louis knockout. And we were trying to find a way to end the segment and have some kind of signature. So this guy gives me this tape, and it was Genial Johnny Addy. This was before the big bluster with Michael Buffer, and all of these guys were screaming and yelling, and his brother, of course, who does the UFC fights and is screaming at the top of his lungs. And it was great simplicity because the mic used to drop down from the ceiling at Sunnyside Garden in New York. And this little guy in a tuxedo, Genial Johnny Addy, who was a legendary ring announcer, would just say after the guy got knocked out, "The time." And so I used that as the close to every segment. I would say we'll be back in a moment now that the time. Program directors hated this. I don't know if you got any of this feedback from any of the people that you deal with at Gulfstream Park or any of the other tracks where you were using this, River Downs, but they hated it. And they used to constantly tell me, "Yeah, you ought to get rid of that shit." And I still have little kids running up to me in the street and they'll go, "Hey, you're Defo. The time." So it definitely works. And it's stuck with me. All right. Well, I started to talk about our humble beginnings. And I guess these were quarter horses. That this wasn't the match racing that they were using to try and comply with the cockamamie rule that they had to get the casino going at Hialeah
No,
Park. So they were running quarter horse races. What? How many days a week? What was it? A couple of days a week that they were doing that?
4 days. There was a meet we did 4 days. I think there was another meet where we did 3 days, but it was at least 3 days. But I think it was four when I first met you.
And you're in the stands in a makeshift announcer's booth, and I
Yeah,
always thought that that was your first job, but you had worked other places before then.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I called my first race at Relito Park in Tucson, Arizona. It was $1,000 maiden race going half a mile, and so that was where I got to call the first race, and then I worked the Arizona County Fair Circuit, which we can get into some of those stories if you so desire, because I
Yes,
saw and experienced things on that circuit that people wouldn't even believe.
I would imagine.
Uh, and then I bounced around. I was in college at the time, so I was just trying to get as many opportunities as I could get. So I went to Finger Lakes for a summer to try to get some sort of demo tape put together to get a job, and that was when Ross Morton was still there. And
Whoa.
I,
We called him Aqualung
I,
when he was calling it Gulfstream because it sounded like he was underwater, even though he was a very distinguished gentleman and a good guy. And think about that. That's an odd pairing. He had the winter meet at Gulfstream Park, and then after that, they shipped him off to Rochester somewhere, Canandaigua, so that he would end up doing the Finger Lakes calls, where he was probably more closely associated with that track than he even was Gulfstream.
yeah, and so I'll tell you a quick story about that. So he was not a big fan of. I don't think it was personal, but I think that it was. He was there over 50 years at that time. So I thought naively, I said, "Well, this guy's got to have job security. He's been the only track announcer since they've opened the track."
Yes,
Uh, and that was wrong because it was like, yeah, he had been there that long. Now he thinks they're coming to bring in his replacement.
sure.
So he was less than willing to help me. So there was a period where I got to call one race and then I got to call another race, and I was like, this is not enough for a demo reel. So I got mad and I said, I came up here to be an intern, yes, but the idea was that I was going to get to call races enough to get a demo tape. I said, I need to be able to call back to back races. I need to work in that level of practice. And so the general manager or the racing director at the time, he said, "Well, I think Ross's granddaughter's bat mitzvah is on Saturday, and he wasn't going to take the day off for it. So maybe we'll give him the day off for it, and if it's okay with you, you can call the races that day."
Oh, great.
So I said, "Oh, that's beautiful." So they go to Ross and they said, "Ross, you should take your Saturday off. We're going to give you Saturday off with pay to go to your granddaughter's bat mitzvah, and Pete's going to call the races." And Ross says, "No, no, I can't do that. What we'll do, I'll come in and I'll call the first two races, and then I'll leave after the first two races, just so the fans know that I'm okay." So, so that's what happened. So he came in, he called the first two races, and he left. Right.
Yeah.
Well, as you've already mentioned, he had a in Canandaigua, New York, which is right outside Farmington, which is where the track is technically located.
Uh-huh.
He had the replay show, which I know you're very familiar with hosting replay
Yes,
shows.
yes, I did that.
It was his. It was Ross Morton's Winner Circle.
Nice.
So at that time there was no way of getting instant replays. So I wanted to hear the calls. I wanted to critique myself to see, are these calls good enough to make it to a demo tape. So I rushed home to Canandaigua to turn on the local TV channel, and I get it on, and first two races, and then he comes back from a break. We'll be back right after this. Then he comes back from the break, and he had gone to the TV station after he left Finger Lakes that morning to record this message. He comes back on him. He goes, ladies and gentlemen, we apologize, but we have an amateur announcer for the rest of the day. He says,
That's some vintage.
this was,
It's classic.
he goes, this was not our choice. Please bear with us. We'll be back tomorrow. But for now, an amateur announcer for the rest of the day.
I thought you were going to say that he voiced over the races that you
Well,
by himself at the studio.
and that's what I was just going to say. He could have done that. That
Yeah.
would have been the worst thing he could have done. So at least he just called me an amateur announcer, but he left the audio on.
Was that a hairpiece he was wearing, or was that his real hair? It's
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
like Bill Self,
No.
where you're not sure.
100% hairpiece. And the other thing I know, and don't get me wrong, I enjoyed working with Ross for all the wrong reasons, but also one of the only individuals I've ever met that eats salad with his hands.
There is some bizarre characteristics of you guys that we'll have to explore. But
Yes.
so before that, you're on the fair circuit, and I always loved the L.A. County Fair Circuit. I was there covering racing, and they would go to Santa Anita. Back then, there was Hollywood Park, and then you had a couple of weeks a year that they were at the Pomona Fair, the L.A. County Fair at Pomona, which became Fairplex. And that was a great betting track. Horses coming from all over the place. Some horse that had run 12th and never been ahead of a horse and was 25 lengths behind at every stage of a Del Mar race would be 1-9, going against these pigs that were coming in from Tucson and all kind of Turf Paradise and other smaller tracks. And it was great because it was called a bull ring. It was a half-mile track. And it wasn't really commensurate with running thoroughbred races. There were a couple of guys that were really expert at riding.
Martin Pedrosa.
Yeah, and Francisco Mena, what was the king of the bull ring back then, old-time jockey in California. And if you didn't make the first turn correctly, you ended up, your horse was hanging from the fucking Ferris wheel, which was just to the right of the first turn of the track. And you're like, where's the 3? And then you would see him just kind of, lollygagging there on the Ferris wheel. It was a very bizarre circuit. And it also, I'll never forget this, I was in Vegas, I was getting clobbered. And I was down to my last $30 or $40. Didn't even have enough money to take a cab to the airport. And I say, look at this. I just look on the board there. I see like Pleasanton going, or one of these fair tracks. And sure enough, I plunge a $20 exacta box on the 1-2, which the odds seem to fit the scenario. And then I look, I'm going, wait a minute. These horses have really funny looking ears as they're going into the gate. And of
Mules.
course, mule racing, which I know you were an expert on. And
I was.
You used to get an erection calling these mule races back in the day, but I would imagine that was part of the scenario when you were doing these county fair meets in Arizona.
No, we didn't have any mules. I know that just so the audience understands that you're not being sarcastic. It is true. I very much enjoyed. There was nothing I enjoyed more than betting on mule racing when they had mule racing in California. That is true.
All over the track. I mean, they could run in. They could run right into the infield lake out of the break.
Well, Ferndale, California, which still runs, they had the best one of all, which was the Cream City Dash for mules around a turn. And let me tell you, that was worth the price of admission every year because there would be 8 mules, and when they went to the turn, 4 of them turned left, and the other 4 kept going straight.
Weren't the most cooperative of animals, as we well know. Anybody who's ever taken that Grand Canyon tour and rented a mule, I mean, you may end up at the bottom of the canyon there with no way to get out. And I'm sure they all were on the level. I don't know. You might have seen some very strange things. It's kind of like when they had the quarter horse meet at Pompano Harness Track when it was a harness track. Now it's a casino, the Pomp, they call it, a Harrah's Casino. But they were running quarter horses for a period of time there. And the syringes would still be in the flanks of the horses as they were going by in the stretch. So you said that you had seen some unusual things on this minor circuit.
Well,
What were some of
I'll
your
tell you. I'll tell you a funny story about that, and I could tell you we could talk for 2 hours just talking about stories from those days. But one of the ones that I enjoyed the most was at that point, uh, if you had a horse who was working out, the workouts were done by hand, and then they were sent to Equibase for him to be put into the actual data system once a week. But they were done by hand. So they would tape the workouts on a printed piece of paper to the door of the track photographer's office at Relito. And periodically, we would go and look at them. And there was a quarter horse that was listed on the workout report, and he was firing bullets every time he worked. But he was listed on the workout report as "Kiss My Ass." And so we knew that, all right, this horse's name is not Kiss My Ass. There's no way that the registration would be approved. So we figured out that, okay, whoever this horse actually is, he's going to look like he's never had any works, or the works are going to be wrong or whatever. So we waited all meet long, and then on the last weekend of the meet, there was a first-time starter quarter horse named Kiss This Act. So and invariably, the gentleman who owned that horse or trained that horse didn't speak very good English. So when he called the clockers, he was saying, "Kiss my ass." And they were hearing "Kiss my ass." And sure enough, this horse had no published workouts. And me and my friend knew. He said, this is Kiss My Ass. And we unloaded on Kiss This Act, who was an easy winner on the debut run.
What a beautiful thing. Yeah, and it's always good to have inside information. It's my favorite form of wagering, especially if it happens to be, for the rare occasion, accurate inside information. All right, so we'll pick up the story here at Hialeah Park. You're calling the quarter horse races. I get introduced to you by the great Frank Fiori. And we were doing, I think we were taping like 3 half-hour television shows a couple of weeks
Yep.
in advance, talking about a variety of things. You were talking about the Dolphins, and it was great. And I thought, wow, this guy's really going to make it. But it seems like it's a long way from those early roots, which had to be circa about 15, 20 years ago. Was it that far back, Pete?
I
And
don't know. 15, that sounds about right to me.
okay, and then you go from there. Now, was the next move Oaklawn Park? That couldn't have been the very next step, could it?
Well, I
You
was at, so
managed
I was
to
at, I
call it
was,
Gulfstream, yeah.
yeah, so I was at Hialeah, and I was go to Hialeah in the wintertime, and then I would go to River Downs in Cincinnati in the summertime. And I did that for a few years. And then there was one particular meet, I think it was 2012 ish. Uh, I get a call from Hialeah while I was in Cincinnati, which was nothing unusual. And it was John Brunetti, senior secretary. She says, John wants to see you in his office in 10 minutes. I said, well, that's not going to happen. I'm not back until after Labor Day.
Yeah.
She goes, oh, well, he's not going to like to hear that. I go, well, that's how it is. I've been coming up here the last 3 or 4 years. This isn't new. So he calls. He goes, hey, I need to talk to you. When are you coming back? I said, I'm not coming back till after Labor Day. No, 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 no. You need to come now. You need to come now. I said, I'm not coming now. I'm not leaving them in the middle of the meet. We're done in 3 weeks. We don't open at Hialeah until the end of November. There's nothing you need in the middle of August that can't wait till September. No, no, I need you now. I said, I'm not coming now. So I go back. First day I get back right after Labor Day, he calls me into his office, and this is exactly what he said to me, word for word. He says, listen to me. I said, all right. He says, I don't care if I have to pay you to sit on the bench. I don't want you on someone else's roster.
Wow.
He said, so you tell those people in Cincinnati, I don't know what deal you have with them, that you don't work there anymore and you work for me year round. And I said, well, John, we don't have year round stuff going on here. He goes,
Right.
I don't care. He says, I don't want you on someone else's roster. So I had to resign my job at River Downs because I can't turn down 12 months work for 6 months work. That's
Sure.
silly. So fast forward about 6 months, we're done with the quarter horses. I'm doing the administrative stuff, which I had done at that time for a few years. And Larry Colmus, who was the announcer at Gulfstream at the time, he calls me. He says, hey, want to get dinner? I said, yeah, sure. So I met him at some place in Aventura, and he said, listen, he goes, Gulfstream's got this crazy idea. They want to run heads up against Calder I don't want any part of it. He says, I'm going back to New Jersey. He says, but they asked me for somebody cheap and local. I gave them your name.
Was it in that order? Cheap and low?
Yeah. So, the ideology was at that time, they were going to run Summers for the first time and try it as a political posturing bargaining chip with Churchill, who owned Calder.
Yes.
So, from Gulfstream's perspective, and I appreciated this, they didn't know if we were going to run 2 weeks and quit, 3 weeks and quit, or never quit and just keep running. And Tim Rippo, who hired me, said, well, I don't want to have to bring some guy who's got friends and family out of state. And then 3 weeks later, we make a deal with Calder, and then they're down, they're out. He said, so at least with you, I understand, and you understand that you're taking this job, but you don't know for how long. And I said, yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity. And I asked Mr. Brunetti if I could do it. And his response to me was, as long as you get done what you need to get done for me, you can do it. So I went 2 days, did that for 2 years. Then we went to 3 days. He let me do it. Then we went to 4 days. He let me do it. Well, by the time I was doing 4 days, I had to pull double shifts. So there were days where we would be running at Gulfstream or Calder, and then after the races would get over, I would drive to Hialeah, since we still had the race book for the horses simulcasting, and I would close. I'd work till midnight, till the last at Charlestown or Remington or whatever we were running. But I was so appreciative of the opportunities. So then Oaklawn, Frank Miramati, a mutual friend of both of us, I believe.
Yes.
He got his dream job, which was Santa Anita Park. So he resigned at Oaklawn, and I put in for the job at Oaklawn. And they called and they hired me at Oaklawn for one season. And well, I didn't know it was going to be one season then, to be fair. There was some, the thing about Oaklawn is it's a lifetime job as long as you don't screw it up.
Right.
So I was there. And then the night before the Arkansas Derby, which was closing day, I get a call from PJ Campo, and he said, "Hey, do you have a contract with those people out there?" I said, "No." He says, "Well, good." He says, "We got to talk when you get home." He says, "I think there's going to be an opportunity for you." What does that mean? So when I got back, the Larry Comas was working in New York at the time, and he realized that he wanted to kind of do what Tom Durkin had done, which was take a couple of steps back in the wintertime. He didn't really, want to work year round. So he said he was giving up Gulfstream to, work in New York and then just take the winter off. And they said, well, he says, the job's yours if you want it. So that was how I was in the right place at the right time every step of the way on that.
It's amazing how things have to fall into place, and it seems like they're coming from left field and right field, and then all of the pieces just happen to come together for you. Couple of things. I knew John Brunetti for a long, long time when I first got to Florida. Of course, one of the first places I visited was Hialeah Park. I started getting involved with racing shows at that point in time, and was always doing something during the Hialeah meet. Brunetti was battling the legislature. They were always trying to figure out who was going to get the premier dates at that time. Calder ran 8 months a year, and Hialeah and Gulfstream split what was called the middle dates and the spring dates. And the middle dates were January and February, far more desirable because that's when people are here. Everybody clears out. They're all schwitzing their brains out by the time you get to April. So, and it seemed like to preserve Hialeah Park, and it should hold a holy place in terms of being a mecca of horse racing anywhere in the world. We thought, well, geez, give these guys a break. But everything was going against them, it seemed like. And Brunetti was seen as sort of, just a bizarre impediment, I guess, to what the state wanted to do and what the other racing entities and interests wanted to do here. And yet he fought this battle. And then I remember being at that press conference that he had when and Frank was there too, Frank Fiori. And, he had finished off saying, well, we're going to have a casino here in 5 years. And everybody, as they were leaving, after having these giant prawns and all of the good food, was saying, Jesus, this fucking guy's crazy. Never going to happen. And it did. It was amazing. So, interesting story about how Brunetti brought you back here, and one thing led to another. But what were your recollections of John Brunetti Sr.?
Well, first of all, I would be remiss if I didn't go a little bit farther back in time and say that if it wasn't for Hialeah Park, I probably wouldn't have fell in love with horse racing. I mean, I used to go there with my family when I was, 3 years old. There's an infamous picture of me in a pink jockey suit running around, running around the track. I mean, that was really where I fell in love with racing. And going as far back as when I was still, in college, just trying to figure out where and what I wanted to do. Everybody said, "Oh, you want to be a race caller? So what's your goal? You want to call the Breeders' Cup? You want to call the Kentucky Derby?" And I told them all. I said, "No." I said, "My dream job would be to call races at Hialeah." And they all laughed at me and they said, "Well, that's a stupid goal because they're closed and they're never going to be reopened." So when they did decide that they were going to reopen, I said, "Well, I'm working there." And that story is actually very interesting as well. I had wrote a cover letter and I had my demo DVD, and I called Frank and I said, "Who do I send this tape to?" And he said, "Send it to Steve Brunetti." I said, "I didn't even know there was a Steve Brunetti." And we just, sadly, we just lost Steve a couple of months ago.
Yes.
But he's John's youngest son, and he wasn't around much at that time. Uh, so Frank knew, well, if he sends it to Steve, then the secretary will sort the mail and it'll at least get it where it needs to go, which was wonderful advice. So I sent it to Steve. Secretary sees it. She hands my stuff to the general manager at the time, and just by some fluke, he reads my cover letter. I had wrote a cover letter and attached my resume and my DVD to it. He reads my cover letter, and I was, very impassioned about how much Hialeah meant to me and how I didn't really care what I wanted to, what they wanted me to do. I just wanted to be part of it. That I was a race caller by trade, but if there was anything they wanted me to do, including sweeping up tickets at the end of the night, I would be, I'd be game for that. So he reads the cover letter. He goes into the marketing director's office and he says, "Hey, did you have an announcer yet?" The marketing director, Mike Cronin, says, "Yes, yes, I do." He goes, "He came highly recommended." He says, "Okay." He goes, "Well, read this cover letter." He says, "Maybe we can use a backup." He says, "This kid's a pretty good writer. Sounds like he really wants to work here." And that was how I got hired at Hialeah. I didn't get hired to be the race caller until I got to call opening day, because the guy who had called the races, who they had hired to call the races the first year, he had a scheduling conflict on opening day. And so I will never forget that. I remember where I was and what he came in, the marketing director, Mike, and he said, "Hey, can you call the races opening day?" I mean, and that was, Defa, that was surreal. There were 32,000 people there. The building was still half condemned. I mean, literally, we couldn't use the grandstand portion of the building. They had just, days before got enough clubhouse seating to even service any sort of a crowd. And as you had already said, there's no announcer booth. There's no roof. I'm calling them in, around in the crowd. Essentially, they had put up a piece of plexiglass and knocked down the partitions of an old grandstand box, and that's where all of us were. So imagine having to call races with 32,000 screaming fans about 100 feet away. I mean, it was something.
Yeah, that's a great memory, and obviously turned out to be a tremendous springboard for you. How did the style evolve? And I know we had talked that you might have met some resistance to some of the things that you were doing, and let's face it, it's not necessarily an art form that has lends itself always to a lot of individualism, and yet. The great announcers were always very distinct, and people love what you do. How did you persist in having the evolution of that style, and how long did it take you to kind of feel like, hey, this is it, this is what I'm going to do the rest of my career?
Well, I knew that I wanted to do the job from the time that I was allowed to call one or two races. As far as being comfortable with my style, we're perfectionists, so I'm never going to be completely comfortable with it. I'm comfortable with the ideology behind my style, which is that if a race is exciting and deserves passion, I mean, and I come from, just to give the listeners a background story, I don't come from horse racing. I come from a long line of degenerate gamblers. My grandfather was a professional greyhound better in the '60s and '70s in Miami at Biscayne and Flagler. And then so he bet horses and dogs. And then my dad, to this day, is still betting anything he can find, horse wise. So I came at it as a fan, Defo. I came at it as a fan. So and I think that has served me well, calling races, because I try to call the races as a fan. If the race is a blowout and it's not exciting, I'm going to make it that way. If the race is super exciting, I don't care if it's a $5,000 claimer or a Grade 1 race, because the reality of the situation is, and I've had numerous stories both in Ohio and at Gulfstream, you have no idea what the story is behind the horses that are winning those lower level races. How do you know? They name the horse after their deceased father-in-law, whose birthday it was the same day that the horse broke his maiden. You don't know those stories.
Sure.
So the point is that I always give the race the level of excitement that it deserves. As far as the individuality, though, there is a story behind that. My mentor was a guy named Luke Rypos, who was the announcer at Churchill and Turf Paradise and Hollywood Park and Riadoso. I mean, he'd been all over the place. But when I met him, he was calling at Churchill and Turf Paradise. And, he helped me get some opportunities and, really, told me what to do and what not to do. But one of the things that he was absolutely adamant about was he didn't want me to try to sound like him. He goes, I don't want you to be compared as, Luke Jr. is what he said, or Luke Light.
Right.
He says, but what you should do is listen to my calls, take one or two lines or phrases that you like I use those. Then listen to another guy you like, take one or two phrases that he has and use those. He said, because the reality is if you have two lines from 18 different guys, that's 36 different phrases.
And
He says, and then at that point, nobody can tell you, oh, you're copying him, because it's like, well, no, I got 34 other lines from other guys. So his point is if you can create your style by imitating the guys that you like, but just not be one or two guys. So, and Frank is funny. Frank Miramonte is funny because he was one of the first ones to call out some of my Phil Saltzmanisms that, because as you have already said on this show, Calder ran 8 months a year, and I'm a South Florida native. So I was listening to Phil Saltzman call races 8 months a year. So it's just natural that I'm going to pick up on some of the same delivery that he had. And he was an old school guy, so he was saying the same things every race, every day. And that was helpful. I didn't Bill. I met him twice in my whole life. But it was helpful because then when it came time to give me a microphone, I knew what I was supposed to say and when I was supposed to say it. Nobody had to tell me that. So that was a good thing.
All right, that was a perfect segue into our mystery guest. This is a little bit of This Is Your Life portion of the program here as we welcome into the show the Afor Mention. And I thought of this because I thought, wow, these two guys have very similar paths. So, Toby, if you can bring in the great Frank Miramonte to the program here.
What's up, gentlemen? Live from a rental car.
Yeah, we lost Pete here for the moment, but we want to go a little split screen here. Frank, how are you? Good to have you on the show. I'm so glad you were able to do this because it's like bringing in 20 different track announcers. As Frank Miramonte, if you're familiar, you're certainly familiar with his voice if you follow horse racing. Race caller at Santa Anita and also Saratoga. Picked that up a couple of years ago, doing a dynamite job. Following the footsteps of many, many legends there. Frank, thanks for joining us here on the show.
Thank you, Defo. You've been on my team from day one. The mighty man, Mike Stevens, introduced me to you prior to my debut at Hialeah Park when I was just filling in. And I was with you then. And so whenever you ask for anything, of course, it's an immediate yes, regardless of where I am, including in this luxurious Chevy Malibu that has been discontinued. But it's great to be here and great to listen to Pete.
All right, yeah, and Pete's telling some great stories, and I don't know if we lost Pete from the program here because there you are. Okay, very good.
I see him. I see him.
And you had a similar path. I remember schwitzing Frank Miramonte. You were soaked in sweat after the first race that you called at Hialeah Park, and I think you still tell the story. You asked me after a couple of races. I happened to run by the booth there to see how you were doing, if you were still alive, and. Pete, you can appreciate this. He says, De Forrest, how does it sound? And my response was,
the fans were not entertained, and they were wondering who the hell this guy was. And and thankfully, you being a legendary broadcaster that you are, you understand that in the end, it's not a fluffathon. You got to be real. And you basically told me that my number was flashing, so to speak, for horse racing. that you could hear the catcher's mitts in the bullpen saying, "When do we get this guy out of here?" So it was very slow. I do have tapes of my first 4 days. I just had to find a VHS player, but I do have videotapes of those 4 days when I auditioned in 1995. Basically, I didn't know I was auditioning; I was simply filling in. But as it turned out, their announcer at the time, Vic Stauffer, left the next year to go to Golden Gate, and they did hire me based on that very lackluster 4 day appearance. But my impressions were good, and I do remember one call in particular. I think it was the Tallahassee Stakes, won by Christy Chapman aboard a horse named Turf Star, and I called it as Trevor Denman, and I know that was a damn good call, and I know that that got their attention, that I had some talent, and the Brunetti family gave me my shot in '96, and it's been a long, long road, but I remember with great fondness and appreciation those days in South Florida.
Well, I remember those late night calls from Great Lakes Downs. It was kind of
There you
like
have
I was working in Radio Purgatory for a couple of years there, and nobody could find me on a dial. I was moving from left to right on the radio dial there. I think it was to the right of Radio Haiti at one point, and
it happened.
I was thinking, you know what, I can relate, Frank. You got to stay in the game, but you did have a similar path as Pete, in that you kind of got your start at Hialeah. Now Pete actually was doing things before that, but he had a great affinity for Hialeah Park, as did you, being a huge racing historian and fan as well. And then was your big break also getting to Oakland Park?
That was an enormous break. So the first call I ever made was at Hollywood Park in 1992 because Trevor Denman, my idol, was on vacation, and they had Gary Henson, the late Gary Henson, whose father was the late great Harry Henson, who had called there for 24 years. Gary was filling in, and I actually picked up the phone one day and called the track president and told him I could imitate both Trevor and the father of the guy filling in. I'd love to send him a tape. Would I be wasting my time? And he said, "I'm not going to say you're wasting your time, but it's highly unlikely." And I've been in sales my whole life, and look, no means you just got to keep fighting till you get yes. So I made a tape. It was a good tape. It was a very entertaining tape. I sent it to him, kept calling, and finally wore him down to the point where he invited me to the press box to call 2 races into a tape recorder that they would compare to the video later that day. So this is in 1992. And the first race was won by a horse named Queen's Page over a simple word. The second race was won by a horse named Voluptuous, trained by Jack Van Berg. And to just think about that, I then called my first race at Hollywood Park a few weeks later, or a week or two later, whenever it was, closing day, 92. It was won by a horse named Glowing Crown, trained by Jack Van Berg. And the reason I mentioned that legend is that you just never know how sometimes you almost think things are predestined. There was a horse named Predestined owned by Fred Hooper. And I always think about that because amazingly, I actually eulogized Jack Van Berg, and one of the greatest honors of my life. We ended up meeting at a Zenyatta party where he was the auctioneer and I was the MC. And he told me that day in front of the crowd, he says, when they put me in a box, that's what he says. So when they put me in a box, I want you to be the one talking about me. And Jack called me 40 hours before he passed away. His daughter called and said, "Jack wants to talk to you." And he called me 40 hours before he passed away. It was on like Christmas Eve or so during those couple of days. And he was real serious in his voice. He wanted to remind me that he wanted it in Hot Springs. He wanted Chaplain Rich from the Oakland Chaplaincy to be there. And I said, "Of course, Jack, I promise you, I've told you numerous times I'm going to do this for you." And my favorite thing about him was he said, I was working at Aqueduct at the time. He said, "What are your days off?" And I said, "Jack, don't worry about my days off, man. I'll be there." But that's how into it he was. And 40 hours later, he passed away. So whenever I think about my first call, I have to honor the late, great Jack Van Berg, to just know that, he played a special role and certainly one of the absolute top honors of my life. I did hit an enormous pick 6 closing out with Jack Van Berg when I was working for Peanuts at Turf Paradise at Hollywood Park on a horse named For the House, holding on by a nostril. And I didn't even mention that during the eulogy because I had to respect him. Even though there were some people that spoke that went off on monumental tangents, I didn't think the pick 6 with Jack Van Berg was an appropriate talking point that day.
Plus, at that stage of your life, you may not have wanted anybody to know that you made that score because it would have been.
That was toast long before that discussion. There was no need to hide that W.
Now, Pete, how did you first cross paths with Frank Miramati, and what was that experience like? Because I know it was unique for me, that's for sure.
Well, I was a fanboy of his. I was a giant fanboy of his, and I still have the very first correspondence we ever had was an email correspondence that I was in college, and they still do that to this day. And I've actually got to kind of complete the circle. The students can pick somebody in the industry that they'd like to have lunch with,
Oh,
and
wow.
the school will do everything they can to facilitate that lunch. And so I said, can I please have lunch with Frank Miramonte? There's no way he's flying to Tucson to do it, but my mind was at least maybe I can get introduced to him roundabout way. And that's what happened. They called Frank and Frank said, listen, I can't do that. But give him my email address. I'd be happy to speak to him on email. And that was how it started. But it's kind of it's like you, Defo. I watched you on TV before I got to know you as a person, and I listened and watched Frank on TV. And a friend of mine actually found the VHS tapes I sent him of some more Hialeah racing reports. So look forward to those for Frank's purposes. And then on the end of one of those tapes is a 1992 racing report show from Gulfstream with a guy by the name of Jeff De Forrest at the helm. So both of those are going to be memorialized and put online.
And of course, Frank, you got started and you were known for these impressions. And I remember telling you, we used to have frequent gatherings in the De Forest backyard there. And
Great backyard.
yes, yeah, it was a great spot. And we would talk into the early hours of the next morning, and Frank would be doing his various impressions. And being a huge fan of all track announcers as I was, and you mentioned a few of them. Of course, you idolized Trevor. You do a dead on Trevor Denman and Harry Henson, one of my all-time favorites.
Sure.
Used to listen to him, and Frank would be doing all these impressions. He'd have us in stitches, Pete, in the backyard. I mean, it was a bunch of racing degenerates as part of the crew there. And I kept thinking to myself, geez, this guy's got such an amazing talent. It's a shame that it's of no value to anybody.
Exactly.
And, like the next day,
great line.
And he says, you won't believe this, De Forrest. I just got a call from the producer of this horse racing movie that's coming out, Seabiscuit, and they need a guy to do all of the old-time track announcers. And so they called you, and you were perfect for the situation. You were going to save them a lot of money. They didn't have to find 20 different guys. And then I guess I'll let you tell the story, Frank. I believe you were at the fairgrounds at the time, and you had some hot babe in tow. And what was the deal? You had like 20 people showing up for the premiere of Seabiscuit. And,
no, that's a different. Yeah. That's the second part. But the first part was I was actually filling in at the Downs at Albuquerque when I was flown to New York to do the job. And I remember getting picked up. And it's the first and the only time I've been picked up with a limousine, a Mercedes-Benz limousine, I might add. And the guy was driving very fast, and that was a great thing. They put me up at a nice hotel, bring me to the studio. There's a huge screen. They're showing me the race. The producer's Gary Ross. He's pointing what I need to do, how I need to call the race, etc. Gary Stevens, who played such an amazing role in the movie, was there. And I did the calls a few times, and Gary comes out and he points. He says, "Put that guy in the credits." I was so excited. So I was the Santa Anita track announcer. So now I'm at Louisiana Downs when the movie finally comes out. I had heard that the video sales of that, which I'll get to later, was so enormous. I was really looking forward to my royalties on this thing. I don't care how small it is. When you're selling, when it's 200 million in video sales, there's got to be some cheese at the end of that tunnel. So anyway, I hit up my mom for a loan on that. That's another whole hilarious story, but an advance loan on unknown royalty. So anyhow, the movie comes out. I'm in Shreveport at the time, and I bring 8 people. Some girl who was shooting me down like a dead bird for a few years during my time there. Bid, comma, faltered, bid, comma, eased, bid, comma, no factor. I mean, really, never lifted a hoof. I had no chance. Only thing I could do is buy her dinner, and that was allowed to do that. Anyhow, long story longer, I got 8 people at the movie. I'm all excited, and the graphic comes up: Santa Anita Park, Arcadia, California. And I'm like, shh, this is it. Not that anyone's talking. We're in a movie, but I'm like, this is it. And so we're listening, and then the race goes off, listening intently. And if you remember the Bionic Woman, you got to go old school. She had an ear that was equivalent to the $6 million man's eye. She could hear anything. And I got news for you. If Lindsay Wagner was in there listening for my race call at Santa Anita, she heard nothing because it was a cricket fest. And the Gary Ross, who ended up himself calling the match race, the famous race that most people, when I told him I was the track announcer of that movie, thought I did. It was him calling that. He decided that music was a better background for that Seabiscuit race, the big cap at Santa Anita, and so you never heard one word. So that was a little bit of a disappointment. I learned what the cutting room floor was, and I'm glad I got some experience in that, because later when I was supposed to be Renzo on the HBO show Luck. And when I say I was supposed to be Renzo, it's not a figment of my imagination. David Milch's quote, "As long as I'm alive, you're Renzo," still echoes in my head quite frequently. And by the way, David Milch is alive, and I was not Renzo. But anyway, he brought me he brought me in a role as Agent 2, I think, which was to show the significance of my role. I did one scene with Nick Nolte, with Nick Nolte and Agent 1, where we were walking and giving him directions as to what barn to go to meet with whoever. And eventually, I was at Oakland. It was my first season at Oakland when I was there. And I was so horrified that I didn't get the gig. But Milch had suggested that, don't worry, I've done this on Deadwood. I've done it on other shows. I'm going to introduce your character and bring him into other roles. So I'm like in episode 8, and I'm waiting. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at the show, and like Nick Nolte is at that barn where he's supposed to be. But the getting of directions from yours truly never was shown on camera. So I missed that one. The next week comes, I was in a non-speaking role on Luck. And in that one, there was a guy consoling me because of the fact that we drew a bad post position. No, excuse me, I was consoling the guy for having a bad post position draw, and the post position draw happened, and I never got seen. And the best part about that was at the end of that show, as opposed to the first one the week before, the credits come up. Agent 2, Frank Miramonte. So I actually make the credits with zero appearance. And the following week, the show got canceled. It was like the weirdest. It was kind of like Twilight Zone-esque the way everything happened. So the cutting room floor is something I'm very familiar with. But Seabiscuit was a big break because I was working for Louisiana Downs, who had just been bought by Harrah's, and they found an opportunity, to basically get some publicity, and they took me on this entire media tour in a professional manner throughout Texas. And here's Frank Miramonte, the voices. Meanwhile, Seabiscuit came and went. And I've only watched the movie once. I couldn't take it a second time. And it's such a great movie, but it was slightly ruined by the fact that I had a phantom role in there. But when the credits rolled, came up Santa Anita track announcer Frank Miramonte. And of course, that was in 2003. 15 years later, that came true. So you just never know how life's twists and turns are going to go. But thanks to Hollywood Park and R.D. Hubbard and John Brunetti at Hialeah Park. And I know Pete loves the Brunetti family. We met, in fact, at Mr. Brunetti's funeral, paying respects to the great man who treated both of us like sons of his own, and we are forever grateful and loyal to the Red Oak stable. You can rest assured, if either one of us ever are calling a race with white and red dots involved, in our heart, no matter how we're sounding, we're rooting for them to get to the winner's circle.
All right. Now, one great thing that I love this because both of you guys are fantastic, and I had the pleasure of getting to know you before all of this got to the point where it is right now, where you're all, you're at the 2 top tracks in the country, and of course Pete's right there. I mean, you could group them all together there. Gulfstream, Santa Anita, and Saratoga is where it's all happening. But you were calling the Breeders' Cup races a couple of years ago, Frank, at Santa Anita. You were set to call the Breeders' Cup races, and Pete, I'll let you tell the story of how you got the opportunity through Frank to go ahead, and that had to be just an absolutely unimaginable high to get a chance to call Breeders' Cup races at Santa Anita Park.
Well, the good news is me and him have already had a lot of these conversations, so there's nothing I can say now that's going to surprise him. But I will say that I thought it was a prank until I actually set foot in the announcer booth at Santa Anita, and he said something to the effect of, "You ready for tomorrow?" I was like, wait, this is actually happening? It was all him. It was all Frank. It was, as we talked about with my story with Ross Morton, it's hard for guys to step aside, whether it's ego or money or both. And in this particular case, it was just a friend doing something for another friend that he knew would be more impactful to me than the idea of him not doing all the Breeders' Cup races. It meant more to me and to my career for Frank to let me call 1 or 2 Breeders' Cup races. It ended up being 2, than it would for him to say I called every Breeders' Cup race at Santa Anita that year. So it was literally Frank. It was Frank being a great friend and a great person, and I'm eternally grateful for it. And and the one good thing about it was I wasn't exactly enamored with the first one that I did. So I was. If you had came into the booth and interviewed me before the second one, I would have said, if I don't nail this second call, then I that I'm going to regret this. I mean, it's the essentially like it's the best way I can describe it in a football reference now is it's Saquon Barkley stepping off the field to let Gainwell carry the ball. Well, sure, if you're Gainwell, you want to carry the ball, but you don't want to fumble it.
Yeah.
You're happy that Saquon gave you the touch, but you want to make sure you make use of it. And that second Breeders' Cup race, I'm really proud of. And we joked after the card on Saturday that he had said to me Friday night. He said, "Man, when you said that horse needs room, I thought to myself, man, he's all in on this horse. I don't know if he's got as much run as he thinks he does." And then the horse got through and kicked on and won it. And Frank was really happy for me. And not 24 hours later, I'm sitting in the clubhouse with their director of racing, Steve Shrenchy at Gulfstream. And Frank's calling the distaff, talking about how much horse Idiomatic has. And I'm literally saying exactly what he had said about me the day before. Man, Frank, I don't know if this filly's got as much horse as you think she does, but I hope so. And, we were both right. So it worked out.
That was one thing. A mutual friend of Frank's and mine. I don't know if you became familiar with the infamous Polyman, but he was always enamored with the ability of Frank Miramati to spot horses that were coming on, and this is a talent that you also need to have if you're a track announcer to be able to figure out that the race isn't over yet and be able to spot horses early that are making moves. And both you guys are absolutely dynamite at that, which is a real skill, a top-notch skill of any play-by-play guy. A couple of things. I know, Frank, I don't want you to get towed while you're in the car here, and
I do. That would make for wonderful TV.
The air conditioning's flowing without noise. This is fantastic. I feel good. It's a good rental car. A big boy like me fits very well in the now discontinued Chevy Malibu.
Yeah, people always, are amazed that you guys can remember the names of horses. I only had a chance to call one race in my lifetime, and even though I'm familiar with announcing and comfortable behind a microphone or whatever, and followed track announcers going all the way back to Fred Capicella, the fans are moving to the rail, and I can mean only one thing: it is now post time. Not a good Capicella. You could probably do
not bad, though. Not bad.
But, not bad.
But everybody wants to know, how the hell do you fucking remember the horses? And then is it more important to be able to forget than it is to remember? Because you still have all the names and colors from the previous races. So I'll let you address it first, Pete. How do you do it? And then, Frank, how do you attack the memorization aspect of the game?
Well, I think our answers might be a little slightly different here. Frank gets very aggravated with me. As long as I don't have a stroke, I have a photographic memory. So the memorization part of it, that's easy. The pronunciation side of it, not so much. I'll wrap myself out. The other day there was a horse that I had forgot to look up before the race was running. I had marked it that I needed to look up what the pronunciation was, and I was sweating a bed at Tampa, so I didn't actually look it up. And then the race ran, and I looked down. I said, "Who is the 7?" And I looked down. I said, "Oh God, I have no idea how to say that." So it was a butcher fest, that particular race.
The names aren't easy either. Frank, how do you go about it? I've seen you do it. Obviously, it gets easier over time. But what was your original approach, and where are you at now?
Well, I learned, what you have to do is you have to pay attention to the silks of the jockeys first, then the equipment that the horses are wearing, like blinkers, shadow roll, things of that nature, and then little distinct things. Now, keep in mind, I called it Hialeah first, so that I worked in the absolute toughest type of environment, because keep in mind, back then there were no colored saddle towels. I love when track announcers say they never look at the saddle towel. That's one of my favorite things.
That's a lie. If in case everyone's understanding what Frank's saying, that is a lie. We don't.
Utter nonsense. But anyway, low to the ground, and so horses get fanned across. It's hard to see them, so you have to really look and pay attention to little things that the sleeve, or like whatever. The caps are very important. The Afor Mention great Luke Kripos told me about the caps and how important it was to learn the caps. It's a good thing to do. I still circle in and color in the silks and the caps in my program. But the thing about it, for Pete and I both, we're both big fans of the game. So we know a lot of these horses just from watching and betting on them anyway. So from there, and also we're both professionals now. We've done it long enough to where we can get our way through if we don't know them all. But you have to know the bulk of them no matter what, or it's going to be obvious to the listener. And you can listen to track announcers, and it's very simple. If you hear too many words between horse names, the announcer has no idea who they are, and that includes Pete and myself in races when we don't do the right thing. And the truth is, it's inexcusable for either of us to ever do that. But we're human. There could be a Tampa race coming up or some other nonsense happening. There was when Candy Ride made his turf debut at Hollywood Park. I was calling a $5,000 claim at Louisiana Downs, and there were two TVs right next to each other. And rest assured, at the clubhouse turn, I looked forward to where there was like 3 left, and I knew it was okay. 5, 3, 8 at the back. Slow that down, drag it out like a slinky, and take a look to see if Stevens could find room on the rail with Candy Ride. So we've been in a lot of situations where you just have to. But the thing that I have to say is, our job is to celebrate winners and to be the spokespeople for our tracks. And so we have a responsibility. It all sounds fun and games, which it is, but in the end, we have a true responsibility, particularly at these big tracks. We feel more of a pressure to deliver because these connections are going to watch these replays over and over again, and they're going to enjoy those moments. And so you want to accentuate the positive. You want to celebrate the winners. And going back to the whole thing at the Breeders' Cup, I think Pete's an absolutely phenomenal race caller. He reads a race. He's second to none in reading how a race develops. It's because it just has that knack. If Saltzman had that knack, it's almost as if when you're a player, you have a better chance of being able to understand what you're watching. And also, as a player that both of us have been in our lives, we don't want to hear a bunch of phantom fluff nonsense calls of some horse closing that's never really going to get there. So we try to then deliver accurately for the audience, and we both take pride in our work. We want the audience to trust that we know what we're saying. Do we make mistakes? Will Pete say a horse is full of run that comes up empty? Of course he will. In time, it's going to happen to all of us. We're not fortune tellers, but I think that the audience respects and trusts both of us to deliver the goods. And therefore, what I say, because, we all have detractors and we all have people that don't appreciate our work or want someone else. My goal every day is to have the people who can't stand me to have the volume up because they want to know what's happening. And then for me, that's a victory. And so that's the way I look at it. There's an old line that a sales manager, when I was selling register receipt tapes at Winn-Dixie in the good old days, told me, and he said very simply, ready? Let your performance speak. And that's what it's all about. You got to come with it. You got to deliver. Pete got his chances in those races like the Pegasus, and he came with the goods, and he delivered phenomenally under the most intense pressure. I had the privilege of calling the Breeders' Cup in 2019 when a couple of weeks before it happened, in fact, 12 days before it happened, I was told I'm not going to call it on track. It turned into something that was very highly unpleasant. Aiden Butler, the head honcho now, who's risen to the top of the company of First, vetoed that thing and let me call him. And I know what that meant to me. And I realized the Gulfstream has not had the Breeders' Cup in a long time. Pete's a guy that, grew up in a very similar fashion, loves Hialeah, loved Phil Saltzman, was a fan of mine, was listening to me. We have a lot of similar personality traits, some of which are good, some of which are not that great. But we're like brothers. And in the end, we worked for Mr. Brunetti. I'm thinking you know what? He should come out here. And I thought the same for Dave Rodman, very underappreciated, legendary track announcer in Maryland. Believe me, if Dave's as good or better than anyone that's calling races right now, I can tell you that right now. He takes a backseat to nobody, and he comes with it day in and day out. And I invited him; he didn't want to do it. But the thing that Pete mentioned about calling 2 races, in a sense, you get an opportunity like that. There's no upside to just call 1. If you screw up, it's a horrifying experience. If you do well, oh well. So, and he didn't do badly the first time, but he's his own worst critic, just like I am. And he wanted to come with an absolutely legendary call, which he did the second time. His first call was absolutely fine, and he did it with people in the booth and under a lot of pressure. But we, both Pete and I, we are driven by challenges, and we will probably succeed more when the pressure is highest, because that's when that's at that point it's us, the binoculars, and the horses, and that's it, and we got to come with it. And that's what we have to call on our whole life of being fans and wanting to do the right thing for the connection. So Pete and I have a lot of common. I don't think it was some Herculean thing I did for him. I know my boss was impressed that I offered it to him, but you know what, it made me feel good, to do something for someone else when I've had chance after chance. People have given me a shot. People have have overlooked mistakes I've made to give me more shots. You got to give people a chance. And for Pete, that's a lifetime memory. And it makes me happy because he's a good guy and he calls a hell of a race. And he does it every day with passion, with enthusiasm, and with a love for the sport. There was a maiden race the other day. There was a Pletcher in there, and then there was a Windstar. I don't know who trained the Windstar. Well, it might have been Brad Cox. But those two squared off.
Those horses could have won.
Yeah, those are two horses, and Pete was setting the stage for, hey, these are some this and this, blah blah blah, and he's basically setting the stage for this big showdown. And he called the race, talk about the horse's ears up, that he's a classy horse. Like, you can feel the passion. You can't make up passion. Pete has it, and that's why I'm a big fan of his work.
Well, we all are, and both of you guys have been fantastic. An hour that's flown by and just been overwhelmingly entertaining, as both of you guys always are. Pete Aiello, we'll look forward to your calls at Gulfstream Park. Frank, what opens the day after Christmas? It'll be Santa Anita, and maybe you can say goodbye to the folks as Trevor Denman or one of your many race announcer voices.
Ultimately, it's about the day after Christmas. There's a lot of Santa Claus fans out there, but the real present gets opened on 12/26. Trevor Denman saying, thanks for being with us, and now, good night to you all.
All right, Frank Miramati, Pete Aiello, thanks so much. Fascinating edition here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, guys, so much for doing this. Appreciate it. All right,
I enjoyed this.
In the game there. Pete Aiello, Gulfstream Park, Frank Miramati, Santa Anita, Saratoga. I'm Jeff De Forrest. Thanks so much for tuning in on Bleacher Brothers to this week's edition of Conversations.